Hi, I'm Allie Janes in for Jamie Poisson. This month, 2 flights landed in the African nations of South Sudan and Eswatini, transporting migrants from U.S. prisons who, for the most part, have no connection to these countries. In at least one of these cases, migrants were told that they would be transported to a detention facility in the United States, and instead were taken to a prison located nearly 10,000 kilometers away from the U.S. Now, this decision to deport groups of people in American prisons against their will to detention camps in nations they have never visited marks a radical and unprecedented shift in American policy. Legal experts say it might well be unconstitutional. It's also probably worth noting that we have talked a lot about ICE on this show over the past few months, and although little is known in many of their cases, more than 50 Canadians are being held in the custody of ICE, many of whom were arrested unexpectedly amid Trump's immigration crackdown. At least one Canadian has died in an ICE detention facility. Hamid Ali Aziz is an immigration reporter with the New York Times, and he joins us for a conversation about the offshoring of immigration detention and 2 notorious facilities at the center of Trump's immigration detention plan, American Siberia and Alligator Alcatraz. Hi, Hamid. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's begin with this story of 8 men in ICE custody who were told that they were about to board a flight from a detention facility in Texas to one in Louisiana. And hours later, they landed on a U.S. military base in the East African nation of Djibouti. They were held there for weeks, legs shackled, in shipping containers. Before we get into their eventual destination, can you just walk me through the series of events which sees a group of men in the custody of ICE sent to a military base on the other side of the world?
Yeah, this was a really remarkable moment in American immigration history in the modern era. You know, the Trump administration has been focused on trying to deport people to countries that are not their own. And this is an effort ultimately at deterrence, trying to encourage people not only to not enter the country illegally, but to, if they are in the country illegally in America, to self-deport, to leave. This is in many ways in support of that. So when we get to the situation with these 8 men, it's important to point out that they're from Cuba, Mexico, Vietnam. There's only one man who's from South Sudan. And pretty quickly, they realize, these men in ICE custody, that they are being sent to South Sudan. There is a lawsuit that is filed in federal court in Massachusetts, pretty much, essentially, as this plane is heading on its way to South Sudan.
This morning, a federal judge is ordering the Trump administration to maintain custody of deportees allegedly being sent to countries they are not from, including war-torn South Sudan. Judge Brian Murray.
And in this court hearing, which is, one of the most remarkable hearings that I've ever heard of, where the judge is asking the government's lawyers, what is the final destination of this plane? And the government lawyers are like, well, we can't tell you. This is government secrets. This is classified. This is an information that we can share. It really kicked off the beginning of a very bizarre and intense saga for these men and for the immigration system.
Right, because that court case you're talking about, if I'm understanding correctly, this was like a federal judge intervened using a ruling that cited a previous injunction requiring the Trump administration to give deportees advance notice of their destination and what they called a meaningful chance to object if they believed that they'd be in danger of harm, which, it doesn't sound like they were actually given that. So how were the ICE officials able to kind of circumvent that?
Well, what the judge said was that those individuals needed to remain in U.S. custody, which is why they ended up in Djibouti at that military base, and that those individuals needed to be given a screening for potential fear that they had to be deported to South Sudan. And if they failed that screening, even more time to appeal. And I think the one thing that this administration is trying to do is then they said, openly, is to deport as many people as possible. And what stands in the way of a mass deportation campaign is process, is time, is weeks on end for appeals. This is something that the administration was, fighting against. And ultimately, they made their case to the Supreme Court where they won. And they were allowed to, at least for now, continue with these third country deportations without needing this extensive process. That the judge's ruling was no longer going to be holding them, under this threat of needing to provide people with a lot of time to stop their deportations.
Can you tell me more about this third country policy and the rationale for it?
Yeah, it's a little complicated. Let's just stepping back for a second. ICE has long had an issue, regardless of administration, with deporting people to certain countries. I'm thinking of countries like China, Iran, Afghanistan, Russia, India. Some of them America doesn't have formal diplomatic relations with. Others, countries don't hand out their travel documents for their nationals. They create all these different parameters, and it makes it very difficult for ICE to actually conduct deportation flights to these countries. So, for a long time, ICE has been struggling with what to do with people who can't be deported to their home country. And in fact, they can't hold on to certain people for a long time without the actual realistic possibility of someone being deported. So it causes all these complications. And that's where you saw in the first Trump administration, they wanted to get more third countries involved, to send people to third countries that were not their own. But it wasn't necessarily in service of this complication that I mentioned. It was, in fact, a way to deter people from coming to America. So, this was primarily folks coming from other Central America countries being sent to Guatemala to claim asylum there. And in many ways, we've seen kind of somewhat of a continuation of that. In February, the administration deported hundreds of people to Costa Rica and Panama. These were people from countries that are typically harder to deport to, like Iran, China, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And it kind of seemed like, okay, maybe this is a new frontier on this third country deportation effort. But since then, it's been a little bit tricky to understand. For example, like I said, one of the people on the South Sudan flight is from Mexico,
Hmm.
and Mexico has long taken thousands of their nationals. This is the country that, if I'm not mistaken, the country that the United States deports the most people to. There's a very healthy relationship between Mexico and the United States. So that's one kind of confusing part of this. But I think ultimately it serves as a deterrent. I think it serves as a notice to migrants that, you can end up, even if you're from Cuba, you can end up in Africa. And it's better for you to leave the country on your own. In fact, I've heard this from folks. I was in a ICE processing center in late May, and a Cuban man who had been arrested, I was talking to him, and he was aware of this flight to that was destined for South Sudan, and you could tell he was concerned about it. So it's already kind of making a rippling effect in the communities.
Can you tell me a little bit more about these 8 men? I mean, firstly, what they were in prison for, but also how either they or their families have reacted to this. 'Cause I mean, I can only imagine this would be terrifying.
These individuals had serious criminal histories. One family member of one of the individuals who was sent, his name, the individual who was deported, his name was Tuan Tan Phan. And this was a man who had come to the United States at a very young age, at the age of 9. And he had actually been convicted of killing somebody in a gang altercation back when he was 18 years old. He ended up receiving a 25-year prison sentence. And as a result of that, he was ordered deported from the United States. And for his wife, his wife that I spoke with, her name's Nakfan, she said that he was essentially open to returning to Vietnam. Yes, he'd been ordered deported. This was not something that he wanted. His hope was that after he served his prison sentence, he would be released into the United States. And the way she described it was that he had, spent a lot of time in prison, kind of preparing for the outside world and hoping to have a new start. And instead, he was picked up by ICE and he was taken to ICE detention with the thought that ICE was going to deport him. And I think ultimately this family realized, okay, he's going to be deported. And they planned on his deportation to Vietnam. They were getting his things together, getting luggage together for him to take back to Vietnam. She
Mm.
was preparing her family in Vietnam to welcome him. They were talking about, in the future, her moving there full time, but in the meantime, her kind of going back and forth between Vietnam and America. So there was a real push to focus on a life in Vietnam. Really, kind of in a way, what the United States wants is if you've been ordered deported to accept that and to go home and make a plan for yourself in your home country. And instead, he's sent to South Sudan. And this was something that really, shocked his wife. It was just a moment of fear of, she was just very, very scared. She felt like her husband had been disappeared. That was the experience we heard from somebody close to one of these detainees. Was just a matter of shock, kind of like, how is this possible?
Mm. So, since that Supreme Court decision, earlier this month, we saw another very similar situation where 5 men, also convicted of crimes, were deported to the small African nation of Eswatini without their consent. My understanding is that opposition figures in Eswatini have, they've described this as human trafficking disguised as a deportation program. A couple of them have said that the U.S. is using their country as a dump site. But obviously, the government agreed to this. So, why do you think governments in South Sudan or Eswatini would agree to be part of a program like this? Like, what do they get out of the deal?
Well, with this administration, the State Department, all of these government agencies, the Department of Homeland Security, everyone's empowered to push the deportation campaign, to try to get deals with countries, to have them take in other nationalities. And if there's any resistance, there can be a consequence.
Well, the U.S. has announced that it's revoking all visas for South Sudanese passport holders and blocking new arrivals effective immediately. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, says the move is in response to the African nation refusing to accept the return of its repatriated citizens. The Trump administration
And so you
has
see
taken
how
aggressive measures
very
to crack down
quickly,
on immigration.
if these nations are not going to be cooperative on immigration, there can be very clear consequences. And I think on the flip side, helping the Trump administration with their number one priority, no doubt puts these countries in a more favorable light, in a better spot with this administration.
So I want to pivot for a moment from this international conversation to talk about migrants who are being detained in the U.S. domestically, and in particular, there's a couple facilities I'd love to talk about, and the first is one in Louisiana, in this little country town called Jenna. I believe that the population is around 4,000 people. I've seen it described by one reporter in Slate as American Siberia. So, talk to me about how this particular facility became a mainstay for ICE and why it is so infamous.
Well, I would say that for the most part, ICE relies on their bigger facilities in the southern part of the United States, in states like Texas, Louisiana, and elsewhere, primarily because ICE detention has become a point of contention in more progressive communities, in states where these detention centers are no longer accepted. There have been laws passed to try to ban ICE detention in states. So increasingly, ICE has had to rely on detention centers in the South. And one of the issues with these detention centers, according to immigration advocates, is that they're so far away from legal access, and, as opposed to places that are near big cities. Some of the locations in the South are far away from a multitude of lawyers, and that creates a problem of, an inability to access an attorney, which is essential for these migrants who are trying to fight their deportation cases.
Hmm. Under this second Trump administration, we've heard hundreds of stories of people being essentially kidnapped off the street by ICE. We've heard of people being arrested at these almost entrapment style immigration hearings, immigrants arrested even after their cases are dismissed. And we've also heard in some cases about American born people being caught up in this ICE enforcement dragnet. So talk to me about who's being sent to this facility and what a person's chances are of getting out once they're in.
Yeah, I mean, specifically on who is in the facility, I can't say as far as like what nationalities are there right now. That's not public information. But I would just say in general practice, ICE is willing to and has moved migrants from who've been arrested in one part of the country to another part of the country. So you will have people who've been arrested in Boston and New York and elsewhere who are sent to Louisiana. I mean, in fact, this is what happened in the case of some of the students, the international students who were arrested by ICE infamously earlier this year. They were
Mhm.
sent to ICE detention facilities in the South, including in Louisiana.
If I'm not
Uh,
mistaken, Mahmoud Khalil, the Palestinian activist, was sent to this facility, right?
Mahmoud Khalil is a Columbia University graduate. He was arrested by US immigration agents on the 8th of March. The US government wanted to deport him, arguing his activism was detrimental to its foreign policy interests. But in late June, after spending more than 100 days in immigration detention, a federal judge ruled that Mr. Khalil was not a flight risk or threat to his community and could be released.
it's just another point. Like they're willing to send people to these facilities. There's more room. They, it's closer to some of the deportation flight locations. There's just a whole mechanism. There's a whole process surrounding it. But I would say, as far as who's being caught up in these immigration operations, you see right now that ICE is under pressure to deliver numbers, and so migrants are being arrested when they show up at their court hearings, um, at different interviews with the immigration agencies. They're being picked up, even if they're not the target of a operation. If they're just around someone who's a target of the operation. Basically, what this administration has done is that if you are undocumented, you are a priority.
And many of these, of course, are not convicted of any crime when they're being held there. The next facility I wanted to talk about is one that has been built very hastily, very recently, known as Alligator Alcatraz in Florida, which you've done some reporting on. And when we're looking at other ICE detention centers in Florida, there was just recently this Human Rights Watch report that found wide scale abuses in some of these facilities around Miami. Things like, detainees being made to kneel and eat like dogs, people denied food, female detainees forced to use the toilets in full view of male detainees. And so, what can you tell me about the conditions at this new facility, Alligator Alcatraz, and the kind of conditions that people are being held in there?
Yeah, this is a really remarkable situation we have right now, where the state of Florida has built an immigration detention center. This is, nothing like this exists in America right now, and this is kind of an experiment in many ways. And we've heard from detainees that there were infrequent showers, the meals didn't amount to much, that detainees were getting sick, and definitely there was a sense from detainees that people were on edge with just a lack of information. One detainee said that it was like it's a tinderbox, and but what the state says, what the administration says, is that this is basically helping the federal government to carry out their mass deportation goals, creating more capacity, the state helping DHS to enforce immigration laws and to deport people at a time when ICE is looking for as much detention capacity as possible. And, it really does speak to the fact that Florida, unlike other states, has really kind of led and been at the forefront of collaborating and cooperating with ICE. Not only have they created this really unique immigration detention center, but they have their officers in a program where they actually help ICE officers by picking up immigrants, by detaining immigrants. So they're not only helping them to hold them in a detention center, but also helping them pick up immigrants as well. It's almost a force multiplier for ICE. There's just been a real cry of outrage from advocates who say that this is inappropriate, that it's illegal, and that these migrants just simply do not have the access to attorneys like they do in other detention centers. I mean, for any ICE detainee in federal custody, you can look them up in a government database. You can see where they're being held. But for this detention center, you cannot. And that's, caused some consternation amongst a lot of folks.
Let's talk about what this might end up looking like down the road then. I mean, this third country policy is, concerning for many people because of, as we've been talking about, its challenge of the law and the precedent it sets and this kind of radical shift that it seems to mark. And because people have a lot of fears about where this could lead, particularly because, for example, Donald Trump has talked quite a bit about the prospect of stripping American-born citizens of their citizenship status and sending them to foreign countries as well.
We can now promptly file to proceed with numerous policies that have been wrongly enjoined on a nationwide basis. And some of the cases we're talking about would be ending birthright citizenship, which now comes to the fore. That was meant for the babies of slaves. It wasn't meant for people trying to scam the system and come into the country.
Is there any fear about the prospect that this program could serve like as a kind of primer for one that could eventually be focused on American citizens as well?
No, I think no, just because the process of denaturalizing somebody, of stripping citizenship from somebody who has immigrated to this country and who has gained citizenship, that process is extensive, and the government has to go through a long process where they have to prove, a whole set of things, including, that somebody committed fraud in gaining their U.S. citizenship. Typically, we've seen historically this is for people who have hidden some sort of history of being in a military in their own country, or being a war criminal, or whatever it may be. So the bar is historically quite high, and there isn't just some mass. There hasn't been a mass effort to denaturalize in the modern era.
Mm-hmm.
But we have seen that this administration has said that denaturalization is a priority.
The memo from the Trump administration says they want to denaturalize U.S. citizens for serious offenses. Those would include war crimes, but also suspicions of lying on immigration forms and defrauding the government for benefits. I'm also told this denaturalization process would happen under civil law. This means the government has a lower bar to prove offenses, and defendants will have no right to an attorney.
I think the key is seeing how they're actually going to implement that, how they're actually going to carry that out, because they said the same thing essentially in the first administration in 2020, and it wasn't a massive change in any big shift. So I think right now it's still wait and see, but that doesn't mean that for folks who are here who are undocumented or have status that is, have a visa that's going to expire, and they don't plan on leaving the country. Like all these groups of people, if you are in the country without legal status, the administration's priority is to deport you, to arrest you, and sometimes that means being sent to a third country.
I mean, I've seen some people kind of just describe fears of this turning into like a kind of Guantanamo 2.0, not for terrorism suspects, but for immigrants, for asylum seekers, for dissidents. Is that a concern that you've heard about?
Yeah, people have raised all kinds of concerns about the idea of taking people to a foreign country that's not their own. There has been a real fervent pushback to these deportations. But, thus far, the courts have resisted this advocacy, this opposition, this feeling that these are in many ways government-led disappearances. I mean, that is the way some people have framed it, and thus far the administration has been able to continue it.
Hamid, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that's all for today. I'm Allie Janes. Thanks so much for listening to Front Burner, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.